Blood on the floor, a flatlining monitor, and a hospital administrator demanding a dying Marine be pushed out the door for lacking the right insurance. Nurse Sarah Jenkins had a choice: follow corporate policy and let a hero die, or save him and destroy her own career. She chose the latter. Prescott General was not a hospital that catered to the desperate. Nestled in the affluent suburbs of Chicago, it was a pristine, profit-driven institution with marble floors in the lobby and a board of directors who cared more about quarterly earnings than the Hippocratic Oath. Sarah Jenkins had worked in its emergency department for 12 years. At 38, she was the veteran charge nurse, known for her sharp instincts, steady hands, and an unwavering moral compass that often put her at odds with management. It was a torrential Tuesday night when the sliding doors of the ER blew open. Paramedics rushed in, shouting over the sound of the rain and the chaotic din of the waiting room. On the gurney was a young man, barely recognizable through the blood and mud. 24-year-old male, severe blunt force trauma and internal hemorrhaging. The lead paramedic barked, breathless, as he helped transfer the patient to a hospital bed. Hit and run on Interstate 90. Blood pressure is tanking, 60/40 and dropping. Sarah was at the bedside in a second, her shears cutting away the man's soaked jacket. Beneath the ruined fabric, she saw the unmistakable eagle, globe, and anchor tattooed on his left pectoral muscle. He was a United States Marine. A wallet, recovered by the EMTs, identified him as Corporal Thomas Miller. "Let's get 2 large-bore IVs going, push saline, and page doctor." "Hayes, immediately," Sarah ordered, her voice cutting through the panic. "We need O-negative blood down here, now." Just as she was prepping Thomas for an emergency intubation, the heavy wooden doors of the trauma bay swung open. In walked Richard Sterling, the hospital's chief administrator. Sterling was a man who wore custom Italian suits to a place where people bled out. He operated on spreadsheets, not empathy. He held a tablet in his hand, his expression pinched in deep annoyance. "Hold the blood, Nurse Jenkins," Sterling commanded, his voice cold and authoritative. Sarah paused, a bag of saline in her hands, staring at him as if he had just spoken in tongues. "Excuse me, this man is crashing, Mr. Sterling. He's bleeding out into his abdomen." Sterling tapped his tablet. "I've just had billing run his ID. Corporal Miller has standard military coverage, but he's out of network, and his secondary insurance lapsed 3 months ago. Prescott General is not authorized to perform high-risk, uncompensated trauma surgery on him. Protocol dictates we stabilize and transfer him to Cook County General." Sarah's blood ran cold. Cook County General was a 25-minute ambulance ride in good weather. In this storm, it would take 40. "Stabilize him," Sarah yelled, abandoning professional decorum. "He has a ruptured spleen and likely a torn hepatic artery. If we put him back in an ambulance, he would be dead before they clear the parking lot. He needs an operating room right this second." "He is not our financial liability, Jenkins," Sterling fired back, stepping closer, his eyes narrowing. "You know the policies. We are not a charity." "Call the transport." Thomas groaned, a wet, rattling sound escaping his throat. His monitors began to wail, the jagged lines on the screen flattening out. Sarah looked at the young Marine. He had survived war zones only to be left to die on a sterile hospital bed, because a man in a suit didn't want to take a hit on the hospital's profit margins. Something inside Sarah snapped. The rules, the protocols, the threat of Sterling's wrath, it all vanished. "Get out of my trauma room," Sarah growled. Sterling blinked, taken aback. "What did you just say to me?" "I said, get out." Sarah shoved past him, grabbing the defibrillator paddles. "Charge to 200. Clear." The Marine's body arched off the table. A heartbeat flickered back onto the monitor, weak. But there, Dr. Gregory Hayes, the attending surgeon, finally rushed into the room, looking frantically between Sarah and the furious administrator. "Dr. Hayes," Sarah commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Patient has massive internal bleeding. We are bypassing protocol and taking him to OR3 right now. If you don't scrub him, I'll open him up myself. No, tss, mouth, and Hayes looked at Sterling, who was practically shaking with rage. If you operate on this man, Hayes, you'll both be answering to the board, Sterling threatened. Hayes, usually a timid man, looked down at the young Marine, then at Sarah's fierce, uncompromising eyes. He swallowed hard. Prep OR3, the doctor muttered. Jenkins, you are making the biggest mistake of your life, Sterling hissed, as Sarah pushed the gurney past him, the wheels catching the edge of his expensive leather shoes. I'll live with it, Sarah replied without looking back. Now move. For 4 agonizing hours, Sarah and Dr. Ace fought to keep Corporal Thomas Miller tethered to the living world. It was a brutal surgery. They went through 10 units of blood, plumping arteries and repairing the massive damage caused by the hit and run. By the time they finally closed him up, the sun was beginning to rise over Chicago, casting a dull gray light through the hospital windows. Thomas was transferred to the intensive care unit, stabilized and heavily sedated. He was going to live. Exhausted, her scrubs stained with sweat and the Marine's blood, Sarah walked into the staff break room and collapsed onto a plastic chair. She poured a cup of stale coffee, her hands trembling from the adrenaline crash. She had saved a life. She knew she had done the right thing. But Prescott General did not reward morality. It enforced compliance. At 8 a.m. sharp, the PA system crackled. Nurse Sarah Jenkins, please report to administration. Nurse Jenkins, to administration. Sarah didn't bother changing her scrubs. She walked down the quiet, carpeted hallways of the executive wing, feeling the stares of the administrative assistants. When she entered Sterling's office, she found him sitting behind his mahogany desk, flanked by the Director of Human Resources and a hospital security guard. Sit down, Sarah, Sterling said, omitting her title. I prefer to stand, she replied, crossing her arms. Sterling sighed, a performative display of disappointment. What you did last night was a gross violation of hospital policy, a massive overstep of your nursing authority, and a direct act of insubordination against a superior. You forced a surgeon into an unauthorized, uncompensated procedure that has cost this hospital upwards of $80,000. I saved a 24-year-old veteran's life, Sarah stated, her voice remarkably steady. If I had followed your order, he would be in the morgue right now. You don't get to make financial decisions for Prescott General, the HR director chimed in, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. Effective immediately, your employment here is terminated. We are also filing a formal complaint with the State Nursing Board for insubordination and reckless conduct. You'll be lucky if you keep your license. Sarah looked at the termination papers. 12 years of missed holidays, double shifts, holding the hands of dying patients, and saving countless lives. Gone in a single morning because she refused to let a young man die over an insurance technicality. Sign the paperwork, clean out your locker, and security will escort you off the premises, Sterling said, not even looking her in the eye, his attention already returning to his computer monitor. A hot wave of tears pricked the back of Sarah's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She snatched the pen, signed the paper with aggressive, sharp strokes, and tossed it back at him. You're a coward, Richard, she whispered, and this hospital is a graveyard run by accountants. Now, cocket, yeah. 10 minutes later, Sarah was walking out of the glass doors of Prescott General, carrying a small cardboard box containing a coffee mug, a stethoscope, and a framed photo of her late mother. The security guard walked 2 paces behind her, ensuring she left the property. The rain had stopped, leaving the morning air bitterly cold. She unlocked her rusted sedan, placed the box on the passenger seat, and finally broke down, weeping against the steering wheel. Her career was over. The bills were piling up. She had no safety net. What Sarah didn't know was that while she was being marched out of the hospital like a criminal, a very different scene was unfolding up in the ICU. A heavy set of boots echoed down the tiled hallway. The nurses of the station looked up, their breath catching in their throats. Approaching the desk was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. He stood 6'4", with a thick beard, heavily tattooed arms, and a scarred face. But it wasn't his size that intimidated the staff. It was the leather cut he wore over his denim jacket. On the back, clear as day, was the winged death head. He was a patched member of the Hells Angels motorcycle club, specifically Jackson Miller, the vice president of the local charter, and he was Corporal Thomas Miller's older brother. Jackson didn't speak to the administrators. He bypassed security entirely, walking straight to the ICU desk. A young, terrified junior nurse named Chloe stood up. "Can I help you, sir?" Chloe stammered. "I'm looking for Tommy Miller," Jackson rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "I got a call. He was brought in here." "Are you family?" "I'm his brother." Chloe quickly checked the charts and pointed to room 4. "He's in a medically induced coma, but he's stable." The surgery was a success. Jackson's broad shoulders relaxed a fraction of an inch. He walked into the room, staring down at his younger brother, the golden boy of the family, hooked up to a dozen tubes and machines. Jackson sat by the bed for an hour, holding the Marine's hand, before stepping back out to the nurse's station. "Who operated on him?" Jackson asked Chloe, leaning against the counter. "Who brought him back?" Chloe hesitated, looking nervously down the hall. She had been there the night before. She had seen everything. She knew the club's reputation, but she also knew what Sterling had just done to her mentor. "Dr. Hayes did the surgery," Chloe whispered, leaning in close. "But you need to know what really happened. The hospital administrator told the staff to let your brother go. They wanted to put him in an ambulance and ship him to county because of his insurance. He would have died." Jackson's eyes went completely dead. "Who stopped them?" "Sarah Jenkins." "The charge nurse," Chloe said, tears welling in her eyes. "She defied the administrator. She fought for your brother and forced the doctor to operate. And this morning, they fired her for it. They threw her out." Jackson Miller stood in silence for a long moment, digesting the information. The hospital was willing to let his blood brother die over paper money, and a solitary nurse had thrown away her entire life to save him. The code of the Hells Angels was simple. Disrespect is met with hellfire, but loyalty and a life debt are repaid in full. Jackson pulled out a burner phone and dialed a number. "Yeah, it's Jax," he said into the receiver. "Tommy's gonna pull through, but we got a situation. Call the chapter president. Call the boys in Oakland. Call everyone. We owe a debt to a nurse named Sarah Jenkins, and we're gonna pay it." The next 48 hours were a masterclass in bureaucratic cruelty. Sarah Jenkins sat at her cramped kitchen table, staring at a stack of mail that seemed to mock her existence. Outside her window, the Chicago skyline was shrouded in a persistent, miserable fog. Her phone lay silent on the counter. The hospital had already deactivated her staff credentials, her email, and her access to the nursing portal. But Richard Sterling was not content with merely firing her. He wanted to ensure she could never challenge his authority or his narrative ever again. On Thursday morning, a courier arrived at Sarah's door with a thick manila envelope. Inside were 2 documents that made her stomach drop into freefall. The first was a formal summons from the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, the state nursing board. Sterling had fast-tracked a complaint, accusing her of gross medical negligence, unauthorized practice of medicine, and endangering a patient under the influence of severe emotional distress. The second document was an eviction notice. Prescott General's parent corporation, a massive healthcare conglomerate, owned several of the apartment complexes in the medical district, heavily subsidizing rent for core staff. Buried in the fine print of her lease was a clause stating that termination for cause immediately revoked her residency rights. She had exactly 3 days to vacate the premises. "They're burying me," Sarah whispered to her empty apartment, her fingers trembling as she dropped the papers onto the linoleum floor. She had zero savings. She had devoted her entire adult life to the ER, picking up extra shifts, covering for sick colleagues, and living paycheck to paycheck in the city. Now she was losing her license, her home, and her reputation. Across the city, in a heavily fortified industrial park on the south side, a very different kind of board meeting was taking place. The clubhouse of the Chicago South Side Charter of the Hells Angels was a cavernous, dimly lit warehouse filled with the scent of motor oil, stale beer, and old leather. A massive pool table dominated the center of the room, but today no one was playing. 25 fully patched members of the club sat around a scarred oak conference table. The iconic death head insignia glared from the backs of their cuts, a symbol of a brotherhood that operated entirely outside the margins of polite society. Jackson Miller stood at the head of the table. Beside him was Arthur Big Iron Campbell, the chapter president, a man whose rap sheet was as long as his custom chopper. "Tommy woke up this morning," Jackson announced, his deep voice carrying easily through the cavernous room. A low rumble of approval and knuckles rapping against the wood table echoed in response. "Docs say he's going to make a full recovery. He's weak, but he's alive. He's alive because of a civilian." Jackson threw a manila folder onto the center of the table. "Her name is Sarah Jenkins. She was the charge nurse in the trauma ward. The suits at Prescott General wanted to dump Tommy in an ambulance and ship him across the city while he was bleeding out because his secondary insurance lapsed. They wanted to let a United States Marine, our brother, die over a billing code." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The men around the table, veterans, mechanics, outlaws, stiffened, their eyes narrowing with a collective, simmering rage. "Nurse Jenkins defied the chief administrator," Jackson continued, his jaw tight. "She ordered the surgeon to operate. She saved his life, and for that the hospital fired her yesterday." "So we pass the hat," said a burly member named Dutch, reaching for his wallet. "We pay her rent. We take care of her." "It's worse than that," Jackson said, shaking his head. "I had a contact on the inside pull some strings. The administrator, a guy named Richard Sterling, is trying to cover his tracks. He went into the digital logs and altered the timestamps. He's trying to frame Jenkins, claiming she administered the wrong medication and panicked, and that he stepped in to save the day. He's fast-tracked a hearing with the state medical board to strip her license tomorrow morning, and to twist the knife, the hospital corporation owns her building. They just slapped her with a 3-day eviction notice." Silence fell over the clubhouse. It was a heavy, dangerous silence. The Hells Angels lived by a strict, unyielding code. You do not disrespect the club, you do not touch family, and you absolutely do not punish someone who has shed their own blood or sacrificed their livelihood to protect a brother. Big Iron Campbell slowly stood up, placing his massive hands on the table. He looked around the room, making eye contact with every single man present. "This woman put her life on the line for Tommy," Campbell rumbled, his voice like distant thunder. "She stood up to the suits. She fought the law of that hospital, and now they are trying to strip her down to nothing. We don't just owe her a debt. We owe her a shield." Campbell turned to Jackson. "Where is this hearing taking place?" "Downtown, the State Board Annex on the Sales Street. Tomorrow at 9 a.m. "And where does she live?" "West Loop, a corporate high-rise." Campbell nodded slowly, a hard, predatory smile forming beneath his thick gray mustache. "Call the boys at the aviation charter out in Gary. Tell them we need the 2 birds in the air by 800 a.m. Tell them we want cameras on them. We're going to shine a spotlight so bright on this Richard Sterling that the cockroaches have nowhere to hide." Campbell looked back at the 25 men. "Nanta, brothers. Tomorrow morning we are going to church, and we are taking Nurse Jenkins with us." Friday morning broke with a biting, clear chill. Sarah was packing her life into cardboard boxes. She was exhausted, having not slept for 2 days, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. Her hearing was in an hour, but she had no lawyer, no union rep, and no hope. She was scheduled to take the subway downtown, walk into a room of hostile bureaucrats, and watch her life's work be officially erased. At 8:15 a.m., the floorboards of her fifth-story apartment began to vibrate. At first, Sarah thought it was a low-flying commercial jet. But the sound didn't fade, it grew louder, deeper, a rhythmic, guttural roar that rattled the coffee mugs in her cabinets. She walked to her window and looked down at the street. Her breath caught in her throat. Lining the quiet, upscale street of the West Loop were 25 massive custom Harley-Davidson motorcycles. The chrome gleamed in the morning sun. The riders were clad in heavy leather, their club patches proudly displayed. Traffic had completely stopped. Neighbors were peering out of their windows in absolute shock. Before Sarah could process what she was seeing, her apartment buzzer rang. She walked to the intercom, her hands shaking. "Hello, Nurse Jenkins," a deep, gruff voice came through the speaker. "My name is Jackson Miller. I'm Tommy Miller's older brother. I'm coming up." 3 minutes later, Sarah opened her door to find the towering figure of Jackson standing in her hallway. He took off his sunglasses, his scarred face softening as he looked at the exhausted woman before him. "Mr. Miller," Sarah stammered, taking a step back. "I don't understand." "Tommy woke up," Jackson said simply. "He told me he remembers you holding his hand before he went under. He remembers you yelling at the suit. You saved my brother's life, Sarah." "Oh, I was just doing my job," she whispered, a tear finally escaping and tracking down her cheek. "But it cost me everything." "No, it didn't," Jackson said firmly. "I know about the eviction. I know about the board hearing this morning. I know what Sterling is trying to do to your charts." Sarah looked at him, bewildered. "How do you know all that?" Jackson offered a grim smile. "We have our ways, and we don't let our people go into battle alone. Grab your coat, Nurse Jenkins. You have a hearing to get to." "I can't take the subway with all of you," she said, overwhelmed. "You aren't taking the subway. You're riding with us." When Sarah emerged from the lobby of her building, flanked by Jackson, the 24 other angels revved their engines in unison. It was a deafening, terrifying, and beautiful sound, a mechanical symphony of raw power. Jackson handed her a heavy leather jacket and a matte black helmet. He directed her to the back of his custom road glide. "Hold on tight," he instructed. As she climbed onto the back of the bike, wrapping her arms around Jackson's leather-clad waist, a new sound cut through the roar of the engines. Fwok, fwok, quonk, 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 quonk. Sarah looked up. Hovering just a few hundred feet above the street were 2 black helicopters. "What is that?" She shouted over the noise. "Air support," Jackson yelled back, kicking the bike into gear. "We called in a few favors from a private charter. They've got local news stringers on board. We tipped them off that the biggest medical fraud scandal in Chicago history is about to break at the State Board Annex." The convoy moved out. It was a spectacle that paralyzed downtown Chicago. 25 Hell's Angels riding in a tight, disciplined V formation, escorting a single nurse. The local police, unsure of how to handle a massive, highly organized procession, simply blocked off the intersections, allowing the thunderous parade to pass through red lights. Above them, the 2 helicopters tracked their every move, broadcasting the bizarre and cinematic convoy to morning news stations across the city. Inside the State Board Annex, Richard Sterling sat at a long mahogany table, straightening his silk tie. He looked at the panel of 3 state adjudicators, as you can see from the digital logs I've provided. Sterling lied smoothly, tabbing his documents. Nurse Jenkins bypassed all safety protocols, administered unapproved anticoagulants, and nearly cost a patient his life. Her insubordination is a danger to the public. The lead adjudicator looked at his watch. The respondent is 15 minutes late. If she does not arrive, we will proceed with a default revocation of her medical license. Suddenly, the heavy double doors of the hearing room burst open. The security guards at the front desk had wisely chosen not to intervene. Striding down the center aisle of the pristine, quiet room was Sarah Jenkins. But she was not alone. Flanking her on all sides were Jackson Miller, Big Iron Campbell, and 4 other towering members of the Hells Angels, their leather cuts squeaking against the polished wood chairs. The adjudicators gasped, shrinking back into their seats. Sterling stood up, his face draining of all color, his eyes wide with absolute panic. "What is the meaning of this?" the lead adjudicator demanded, his voice cracking. "Security." "You don't need security, Your Honor," Big Iron Campbell said, stepping forward. He reached inside his jacket, causing the panel to flinch, but he only pulled out a silver flash drive. He tossed it onto the table right in front of the adjudicators. "What is this?" the adjudicator asked. "That," Jackson said, pointing a heavy, tattooed finger at Sterling, "is a master copy of Prescott General's internal server logs, sourced by an independent cybersecurity firm we hired overnight. It proves indisputably that Richard Sterling ordered a critically wounded Marine to be dumped on the street to save a buck, and then altered the medical charts at 2 a.m. yesterday to frame Nurse Jenkins." Sterling was sweating profusely, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "This is absurd. These men are criminals." "You can't accept this. The local news stations circling and the 2 choppers outside already have copies." Campbell smiled, revealing a gold tooth. "The FBI's healthcare fraud division got theirs 10 minutes ago." "You're done, suit." Sarah stepped forward, no longer the terrified, exhausted woman from the apartment. She stood tall, bolstered by the wall of leather and muscle behind her. She looked Sterling dead in the eye. "I told you I could live with my decision, Richard," Sarah said, her voice echoing in the silent room. "Can you live with yours?" The hearing was suspended immediately. Within an hour, state investigators were swarming Prescott General. By noon, Richard Sterling was escorted out of his own hospital in handcuffs, facing federal charges for Medicare fraud, record tampering, and severe patient endangerment. As for Sarah, she walked out of the annex into the bright Chicago sunlight. The 25 bikes were waiting for her, engines idling softly. Jackson handed her the helmet once more. "Where to now, Nurse Jenkins?" he asked. Sarah looked at the men who had just saved her life, returning the favor she had given their brother. She smiled, truly smiled for the first time in days. "Let's go back to the hospital. I have a patient I need to check on." Sarah Jenkins never paid for another cup of coffee in Chicago. The medical board quickly dismissed the charges, while Richard Sterling faced federal prison for fraud and patient endangerment. Corporal Thomas Miller made a miraculous recovery, eventually walking his savior down the aisle at her wedding. Sometimes angels don't wear pristine white wings and golden halos. They wear heavy leather, ride chrome motorcycles, and roar like thunder when justice calls.